And today, like I said earlier, we're going to be talking about Jesus' power. Right? Power is a big topic. It is sometimes abstract, sometimes very real. But as I was thinking about this topic today of power, and we're going to be looking at powerlessness, I couldn't help. It was really interesting to see this past week how everything played out in the aftermath of Monday night's football game. So I've seen some Broncos jerseys today, and hopefully they bounce back. But if you didn't watch the game, I'll just really quickly fill you in on the very ending of this game. So the Broncos are driving down. They have a chance. They're down a point. They need any points to win the game. And they have a 4th and 5 where they could either go for a first down with their $250 million quarterback, or they can kick a super long field goal. And the Broncos chose to kick a field goal. They missed it. They lose. Okay? I'm not here to talk about sports strategy. But what was really interesting to me is that in the aftermath and even during that moment, I saw so many expressions of frustration over the powerlessness of watching that decision. Because if you watch Peyton Manning and Eli Manning commentate the game, Peyton's like screaming at the TV. He's so mad. He's like, no, call a timeout, go for it. I heard so many people this week who were talking about they made the totally wrong decision, right? And maybe you're one of those people who, or you know somebody, when you watch a football game, you're like screaming at the TV. And often this happens because there's a certain level of powerlessness over what's happening. You can see what's going on, you want it to change, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. No amount of remote chucking can get the Broncos to go for that 4th down, right? Because you don't have the power in that situation. And if you're not a sports fan, right, you might see this in something else you watch on TV. If you're like a reality show person, you're like screaming at somebody like, don't go for that guy, right? He's not good for you. It's a mistake. But you can't do anything about it, right? It's her decision, not yours. And there's something that just bothers us when we want to change something and we have no power to change it. And while we see this in trivial, fun ways like sports and reality TV, it gets to something more serious too, because we see this play out in all facets of our life. And we see this when it comes to forces of nature. I remember a couple years ago, if you remember when Texas had that terrible ice storm and their whole power grid went off in a chunk of their state. I mean, think about it. We're 21st century, right? We have so much power, so much control, and yet just like that, thousands of people are without power or without heat. Last year, when we were in Missouri and St. Louis, we were only a couple dozen miles from some of the tornadoes that came through and destroyed an Amazon plant and the tornadoes that went down to Kentucky. I mean, there's a powerlessness that we can't stand remotely close to these forces. I think one of the hardest feelings is when you have a loved one who receives a diagnosis, who is going through suffering, and you are powerless to change anything. There's nothing you can do. The idea of powerlessness attacks us because we want to pretend that we have control. We want to pretend, we'd like to think that everything is neat and orderly and I can kind of shape things as I want, and yet when we are confronted with the realities of life, we realize that ultimately we are pretty powerless, that we can't stack up. And so that's why today we're going to be looking at Jesus, looking in his ministry at the power he shows and demonstrates, and what that means for us who lack that power. And so we're going to be looking at one story in Mark chapter 4. Just a little context. We jumped over a section where Jesus is doing some teachings. He's teaching in parables. And after teaching a crowd, he's now going to take them unto the Sea of Galilee. So here we go in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 and onward. So on that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. Okay, so Jesus has been teaching this crowd. They've been listening to him and trying to figure out what he's about. They've been watching him. Jesus says, hey, we got to go to the other side. If you remember, we're at the Sea of Galilee. It's not a huge, but not a small sea, body of water. And so there's towns all around it. And he says, I need to leave this crowd. I need to go to the other side. And this kind of fits. A couple weeks we talked about Jesus not just staying with one group, but he's going around. He's trying to spread this message of teaching. So tells the disciples, let's leave the crowd. Let's go to the other side. And then when they're on the water, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. Okay, so Jesus says, let's get in this boat. They start sailing, and all of a sudden, as they're crossing the sea, this huge windstorm comes upon them. And all of a sudden, you have wind, which creates waves, and all of a sudden, you have waves breaking into the boat. So all of a sudden, it's probably evening, and you have the boat starting to fill water. This is where you start grabbing the pail, and you start bailing water. This just escalates really quickly. The storm comes upon them, and all of a sudden they find themselves in this dire situation. And so what the disciples do is, here's what happens. So in verse 38, but he, that's Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? So this is always one of those like funny moments to me where you have this storm upon it, right? They're grabbing pails, they're panicking, there's wind and there's waves, and where's Jesus? He's taking a nap. He's been doing a lot of teaching, you guys. He's pretty tired. It's hard being the Son of God. And so he's asleep on this cushion, and they go to him, and they wake him. I just picture them shaking him like, come on, Jesus. And they say to him, Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Right? It's kind of a cry for a plea of help. Look around, do you not care? Right? This guy's done all sorts of crazy things, and you're just sleeping now? Do you not care what's happening to us? Jesus then, and he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And so, again, we talked about Mark being very to the point. 2 verses ago, wind comes upon them. Water starts going into their boat. The next verse, they wake up Jesus. And in this verse, Jesus wakes up and he rebukes the wind. He kind of chastises it. He tells it, Peace, be still, and calm. So in 3 verses, we went from them setting out to a storm showing up, Jesus getting woken up, and the storm all of a sudden is silenced at Jesus' word. And Jesus, by talking to the storm, by speaking, all of the wind, all of the water just goes still. And all of a sudden, I just imagine you can't even feel a breeze. The water is just glass. This sharp contrast of just, it's not like, oh, and then within the next hour, things settle down. It's no, just immediately, boom, the wind stops. The waves calm. Jesus says to the disciples, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? So he draws this contrast. He, to a certain extent here, being with Jesus in this boat with him, he's saying that this fear, he's saying, don't you have faith? You're with me, right? So he's comparing these two, he's juxtaposing them. Their response then to this is that they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And so in the book of Mark, that's how we're going to look at in Mark today. We're going to talk about this, but you have this story where Jesus and his disciples are on the water. A storm arises, this terrible storm, and it's crazy. They go to Jesus. He tells the wind to stop, the waters to stop. It settles down. He talks to his disciples, and they ask themselves, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And I want to point out, it would be really easy just to take this story and say, the great thing about Jesus is that when you're with Jesus, all of the craziness of life just stops. Right? All of your storms, they just go away. Boom, gone. But if you've been a Christian for longer than 5 minutes, you've probably realized that being a Christian does not mean, to use the analogy, that your life is going to be smooth sailing. That it's not always so easy. And in fact, this story should clue us in a little bit, because why was it that the disciples were on this sea when the storm comes in the first place? Whose idea was it to go out on the water that day? On that day when evening had come, Jesus said to them, let us go across to the other side. This was Jesus' idea. Jesus is the one who said, hey, come out to the water, fully well knowing that this storm was going to come upon them, that this was not going to be an easy cakewalk for them. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the call to follow Jesus is not a call to an easy life at all. Sometimes the call to follow Jesus is a call to a life that is difficult and is challenging and is confusing. Right? Because this wasn't just a little storm. I don't know if you remember, but when Jesus called his disciples, we know that at least Simon, who is Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. This is their home turf. They've spent their entire life fishing on this sea. I can imagine that they've experienced a storm or two. So the fact that this storm was so startling to them that they had to go to Jesus shows that this was beyond their measure, right? They're experienced on the water, and this was far greater than anything they could comprehend. And who called them there? Who set them up for this? Jesus. call to follow Jesus is not an easy one. It is not one to an easy life, but it is an important one. And it's so easy to respond as the disciples do, right? What did they say to Jesus? They go to him and say, do you not care that we're perishing? And how many times do we go to God and say, God, look at what I'm doing. Do you not care? Look at what I'm going through. I can't handle this. Where are you? Why is this happening to me? I don't understand. And this story has echoes in a couple places in Scripture. And one of the places I want to look at is in the story of Job. You see, just a brief overview of the book of Job, Old Testament story. You have this man named Job who is righteous, and he is good, and he treats people well, and he is godly and fearing. He has lots of great blessings from God. He has a great family. He has great work. He has lots of possessions. And then in the story, long story short, God and the devil are talking, and the devil ends up going to Job and putting afflictions upon him. And so Job loses his children. He loses his possessions. He loses his health. He ends up becoming very sick. And Job, for a while, he's remained steadfast and true to God, but the people in his life, his wife and his friends, they start telling him, clearly all this bad stuff is happening to you. Clearly God doesn't love you. Just curse God, forsake him, and just die already. It's pretty bleak. That's what they keep telling him. And for a while he's faithful, but eventually he has enough of it, and he goes to God, and he's like, God, I have been so good to you. I've done so many things that have been right and righteous. Why is this happening? This shouldn't be happening to somebody like me. And eventually God responds to Job. And you have this powerful section here. It's a little poetic, so it's going to have some unique analogies. But this is Job chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, whirlwind, windstorm, who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. So Job has it with God. He's fed up, right? Why is this happening to me, God? This shouldn't be happening. I've been so good. And a little translation here. So he's saying, who is it that kind of confuses things, right? Darkens counsel by words without knowledge. Who speaks without knowing what's happening, right? You don't have knowledge. You don't know what's going on. So he tells him, all right, kind of man up. I'm going to question you. You answer me, okay? You think you're so smart. You think you know how the world should work. Let's see how this goes. So here's God's questions for him. Where were you, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements? Surely you know, or who stretched the line upon it? He continues, or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far you shall come, and no farther. And here shall your proud waves be stayed. So Job, when he questions God, God's answer is, right, and first I want to just say, if you've read the book of Job, to this point, you know why this has happened to Job. We've seen this encounter where the devil goes and inflicts this upon Job. The devil's trying to test Job. So you know the answer, but God doesn't say, hey, Job, all right, let me tell you, I was having this conversation with the devil, and here's how this went down. No, when Job questions God, he says, where were you when the earth was made? Were you there when I placed the stars in the sky? When I determined how big the earth was going to be? Oh, were you the one who told the sea where it was supposed to start and stop? Are you the one who told the waves that they should be stayed? Answer is no. God was, but you weren't. And so God's response to Job is, Job, you are but a man. You cannot understand these things beyond your comprehension. These are God things, right? And it makes sense. Like we like to say that God is all powerful, right? That he's all loving, that he's everywhere. And one of the things that we don't like to acknowledge is that sometimes God's ways are beyond our ways. If everything God did made sense to me, then it wouldn't be very godlike, because I'm not very godlike. God's ways, his wisdom, the things that happen in this world are beyond our comprehension. And so ultimately, God doesn't tell Job why things are happening. He just says, it's not your place to know. Right? The question is, Job, were you there when this earth was made? Were you there when the oceans were commanded? The answer is that at this time, no man was there. But there was a man who would be there. And that's where Jesus comes in. Because Jesus is the one man who walked this earth who was there, who can tell the waters, here's how far you go, no farther. And you think of how abstract and destructive the forces of nature are, death and illness and natural disasters. They are powerful beyond our measure, but they are unloving. They are indifferent. Think of a tornado. It doesn't care what's in its path. All it does is destroy. Cancer? Cancer doesn't care about you. And yet Jesus is the one who has authority over those things, and he does love you. I was recently reading the Chronicles of Narnia series. I don't know if you've ever read a children's book lately. It's so refreshing. I love it. I'm a better reader than I thought. No, a little ego boost. I love those books. I've never read them before, and so I've read 3 or 4 of them now, and I was startled reading them for the first time. The description of Aslan, who is this lion who is Jesus stand-in. Okay, so Aslan is Jesus in these books. And this is how the main 4 kids are introduced to Aslan. And so they find out he's a lion, which is surprising to them. And so here's from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. "Ooh," Susan said, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." It's a children's book, so they're talking to beavers. Heads up if you haven't read it. "That you will, dearie, and make no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without knocking their knees, they're either braver than most or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe?" said Lucy. "Safe," said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe." The Beavers are telling them, you can't tame Jesus. You can't fit him into a box of what you want. You can't control him. Jesus is powerful. Think of the ship scene that we just watched with the storm. They were scared of the storm, but the only time that they were actually described as terrified was after Jesus told the storm to stop. If that storm was scary, what about somebody who can stop it just like that? He's not a tame lion. Jesus isn't safe. But then Mr. Beaver says this, "Of course he isn't safe, but he's good." That's the hope. That this all-powerful Son of God who is walking amongst them says, who is this? That even the waves and the wind obey him. He's Jesus. And he's not safe and he's not tame and his ways don't always make sense to us. But the assurance that we have is that he is good. That you are on his side. You've been brought into his people. That in this lifetime, you want to go with this analogy, there might be storms, and Jesus is not promising to make all of those go away. But he is promising that he is good and that he is with you. And he ultimately made this shown to us. I mean, he showed it in the calming of this sea. He showed it in the miracles and the healings that he did, but he ultimately showed it in his sacrifice. Because Job is not the only story in the Old Testament that there are parallels to. If you're familiar with the story of Jonah, one of my favorite books of the Bible, in the book of Jonah, you have Jonah fleeing from God's command, and he's on a boat, setting sail on a sea, and the storm comes upon them. And where is Jonah? He's asleep on a cushion. And people go to Jonah, and they wake him up, and they say, hey, this terrible thing is happening. And ultimately, in the book of Jonah, the way that the sea is calmed is not by talking to it, but is by Jonah being thrown overboard. He is thrown into the sea. And for 3 days, he is swallowed by a fish before he comes back on land once again. And in Jesus' life, right, in this situation, he spoke to the sea. He showed his power through his words, but there will be a time where he will be thrown overboard. He will allow himself to be sacrificed. And throughout many cultures, water is often used as a depiction of chaos. It's this uncontrollable force. And ultimately, Jesus is going to allow himself to be swallowed by death and destruction and sin itself And where Jonah sat in the fish for 3 days, Jesus is going to sit in a grave for 3 days. But as Jonah came back, Jesus is going to come back. And his power is going to be shown to be not just over the storms, but over death itself. And that sign is one that was given for you, that you might know that this Jesus, who has the power to stop anything by his own words, just to silence the storms, would give himself up so that you might know his love is and his power is on your side, that you've been brought into his people. And where Jonah was thrown into the sea and Jesus was thrown into the grave, you were thrown into the waters of baptism. And in that, you were given his power. You were promised that you were his child. And so, when you feel powerless, when the situations of life you can't control, the answer is not to seize control, but to turn to Jesus, who is power himself, and remember that you are baptized into his power. That promise that he gave you cannot be taken away. Because there is no force on earth or in heaven that can separate you from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. It is the most powerful force on earth, and it was ultimately given for you. And so in any situation, when you're confronted with an illness of a loved one, when you're confronted with a temptation and addiction that you cannot break, when you're confronted with nature and all of its unloving indifference and power, know that the one who is more powerful than that is on your side. And he loves you. And so I'm not going to tell you that all of the storms of life will go away. I'm not going to tell you that everything will just be smooth sailing, because Jesus doesn't promise that. But he does promise that his power is for you and that he is good. And there will be a day when Jesus returns, when his power will be shown in all of its glory and unfiltered goodness, and all of death, all of destruction, all of sin, all of pain and suffering, and all of natural disasters will be gone, and we'll just rest in his powerful love. And so when you are confronted with challenges, when you are confronted with situations that you don't feel like you have control over, I can't say they'll go away, but I hope that you can turn to Jesus and hear these words that he spoke to the storm, but that he speaks to us too. Peace. Be still. Know that he is God, he is good, and he is for you. It's in Jesus' name, amen.